Okay. Dear all, thank you for joining us to this third Creative PEC Seminar of the year. This year has been very successful, probably beyond our expectations, and we would like to thank you all for contributing with your participation and questions. For those who are not yet familiar with the Creative PEC, we started our work in 2018 to provide a step change in the quality of evidence for the creative industries. And thanks to an extra 5 years of funding by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, we will keep growing the evidence base by addressing industry and government's current priorities for the creative industries, while at the same time advancing research into the longer-term challenges and opportunities facing the sector, including promoting debates around some of these issues, for example, via our seminar series. Now, since June 2023, the center is hosted by Newcastle University in partnership with the Royal Society of Arts. Now, this monthly seminar series is designed to showcase cutting-edge research and foster dialogue across academia, policy, and creative practice. Each online session delves into fresh research, followed by a Q&A session. And people can sign up to the next seminar in May using the link in the events page of the Creative PEC's website. Now, following the seminar by Trinebille last month, today's speaker is Professor Luigi Sacco. Pierluigi is a professor of behavioral economics at the Department of Neuroscience of the University of Chieti Pescara. He is a senior advisor to the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities, and he is an affiliate researcher at the Meta Lab at Harvard. Pierluigi regularly gives courses and invited lectures internationally and consults internationally in the fields of cultural policy, culture, and health and cultural-led development. Pierluigi is a very prolific researcher, having published more than 250 papers on international peer-reviewed journals and edited books with major international publishers. Now, before giving the floor to Pierluigi, a quick reminder to all those online that this seminar is being recorded. And following his talk, we'll have a Q&A session. Kindly use the Q&A function to pose your questions, and I'll make sure that these reach Pierluigi. While we may not be addressing every single question in the chat during the session, we're going to do whatever we can to pass the questions later to Pierluigi and deliver a response to you. Thank you for your collaboration. Now, without any further delay, let me give the virtual floor to Pierluigi, who will speak about the role of emotions, cultural interventions, and behavioral change. Thank you, Pierluigi.
Thank you very much, Giorgio, and so grateful for so many people showing up for this talk. I'm really looking forward to hear your comments and feedback. I will start by sharing my screen so that we have the presentation ready. It should be there. Do you see it? Very good. So the purpose of this talk is to discuss the role of emotions for behavioral change, and in particular, how this relates to arts and culture interventions. This is a topic that is gaining considerable traction. It's becoming, I would say, a global trend, especially in areas like culture, arts and culture, health and well-being. But not only, there are many other areas that are at the moment very promising, like, for example, sustainable behaviors or social cohesion. However, I think that rather than just focusing immediately on certain practices, is extremely useful, or at least it's been for me, trying to understand what are the inherent underlying biobehavioral mechanisms that regulate, that make it possible to generate certain kinds of effects through arts and cultural interventions. As I will try to argue, this is probably the beginning of an alternative paradigm to behavioral interventions with respect to very successful, but also at the same time, largely controversial approaches like nudging and other forms of benevolent paternalism towards behavioral change. So to understand why arts and culture could be a better alternative, we have to delve a little bit into some notions from neuroscience, but I promise it will be non-technical. There will be a couple of, let's say, awkward terminology, but I will quickly explain. And of course, yeah, anything is not clear, I am at your disposal with the questions. Okay, let me check whether, okay. So first of all, emotions. What are we speaking about? So emotions are basically very, very complex affective processes that engage a really, really complex range of neural circuits. We have just scratched the surface of the neuroscience of emotion. We think we know a lot, but the more we know, the less we really are able to map what's out there. And in particular, it's becoming clear that emotions, however complex they are just one single component of a very, very complex and intertwined network that links together issues as fundamental as perception, cognition, motivation, and action itself. So any kind of early neuroscientific characterization of emotion as a realm in itself is now really crumbling down in the face of the evidence that it's practically impossible to speak of emotion without speaking of perception, cognition, motivation, and action. So as a consequence of this, we will have probably also to rethink quite critically some of the tenets of the standard approach to behavioral economics that have been prevailing in the last 20 years. But let's be specific on this. Okay. First of all, what is the perspective of traditional behavioral economics in this regard? In some sense, the golden rule from this point of view is the so-called dual process theory. What do we mean by this? Dual process mainly means that we have two different circuits. These two circuits, for example, have been characterized in a very successful way by the late Daniel Kahneman in terms of the so-called system 1 and system 2. So basically, this approach contends there are two different kinds of circuits that drive our behavior. One is the so-called system 1, as Kahneman puts it, that is fast, easy, impulsive, basically dominated by emotion and very much subject to biases and implemented to these very simple behavioral rules called heuristics. According to this vision, system 1 is at the root of the many things we regret about, because we tend to be too impulsive, we tend to not to think enough in terms of certain types of decisions, and in the end, although of course that's a very economical system from the point of view of saving brain resources and attention, at the same time, it's really conducive to lots of mistakes. Then there is the alternative, that is the so-called system 2, what Kahneman calls system 2, which is the slow system, demanding from the point of view of mental resources, very reflective and driven by cognition. And this is what constitutes the basis of our rational behavior. So according to this vision of dual process theory, our rational behaviors are enabled by the fact that we slow down, we inhibit instinctive responses, fast responses, and most of the time, this is related to the overtaking of emotions. This view has been tremendously influential. And there is today a very wide conviction of the fact that in some sense, emotions are enemy in terms of good decisions. And we should be able to keep them under check and possibly under control to really be able to decide in the most appropriate way. But is it this really an accurate depiction of how our decision system work, and in particular, how emotion and cognition are related to each other in terms of characterizing human decisions and then as a consequence behaviors? Well, probably not. And let me pass to the next slide. Oh, sorry, but it seems to me, for some reason, sorry. there was some skipping of slides. So I will return for a moment, but it's not bad that we started from a characterization of a dual process theory. What we have today learned about emotions is that, as I said, they are part of very complex and especially wide-ranging circuits at the neural level. And in particular, these circuits engage at the same time the cortical level, which is literally the upper layer of our brain, very, very thin, but extremely complex and important part of our brain system that is related to the most important activities of high-level cognition and the cognitive control, and the so-called subcortical part that has to do with parts that are more directly related to the regulation of our not only our physiological behaviors, but also aspects that are deeply related to, for example, emotional response, environmental adaptation, and so on and so forth. There is a slew of very outdated but still extremely popular approaches that basically characterize subcortical layers of the brain in terms of reptile brain or archaic brain, as if there was, this idea that the instinct response that we have is something that has been inherited by our ancestors in the long evolutionary line of animal phylogenesis. But in fact, this is not true, because the brain is such a dynamic system that all parts of it during evolution constantly reorganize. So there is really not a specific and a meaningful way of mapping, for example, today's subcortical areas, not only for humans, but basically for most animals, and what we could have called the reptile brain in terms of the brain organization of our ancestors, very ancient ancestors. So this means that, in particular, what we are learning today is that those parts of beyond the cortex that are typically characterized as part that are responsible for emotions, and in particular for deep emotions like, for example, fear, the so-called amygdala, a small almond-like structure that is one of the most widely studied part of our subcortical regions, are in fact this particular small almond-like area, and in particular one sub-region of it, the so-called basolateral amygdala, is extensively interconnected with the cortex. Interconnected means that there are projections from the amygdala to the cortex and backward projections from the cortex to the amygdala. Very simply, this means that what we have traditionally characterized as the layers that control complex cognition, like the cortex, and the layers that control emotional response, like the amygdala, are in fact in a bidirectional dialogue all the time. And in particular, this subregion means that there is a continuous dialogue in which the cognitive dimension and the emotional dimension cannot be meaningfully separated. They are literally intertwined, and they are generated by the very close dialogue between these two different regions. This means that very practically there is no contraposition between emotion and deliberation in cognitive processes. So, as we said, the perspective of traditional behavioral economics, however, presents us with a very different picture. And the picture, as we already discussed, is that, okay, cognition is good for decision-making, emotion, well, not so good. So this means that we should be able to, in some sense, to separate, to isolate, and in particular, to create the conditions for the takeover of cognitive control as much as we can, especially when important decisions are concerned. But is this the way to reason in the light of what we just said? Probably not. So let's try to understand what does this mean from the perspective of network neuroscience. So in practice, what we are learning today is that there is no such thing as system 1 and system 2. And the very reason is that in system 1, system 2, there is implicitly, but not so much implicitly in the end, a hierarchical principle. So basically, the higher level of control is cognition, and basically when it takes over, so when the hierarchy is respected, we take good decisions and we behave in a proper way. This is not how our brain seems to be organized from what we are increasingly learning from network neuroscience. So the brain has a highly decentralized and mostly horizontal but multi-layered architecture. This means that there is not the prevalence of a single area, but even functions of cognitive control, higher cognitive control, are deeply related to parts that should be, in some sense, hierarchically inferior with respect to traditional visions. In this particular sense, emotions are by all means not nulls. As we will see, emotions are essential facilitators of cognition. Of course, not always, under suitable circumstances. And as you can imagine, the suitable circumstances are very intuitive. If you are completely overtaken by certain types of emotion like rage, probably you are not in the best condition to take wise decisions. That's obvious. But does this mean that when you are completely unaroused emotionally, that's the ideal condition? By all means, not. So the real issue is not emotions, yes or no. The real issue is what kind of emotions, and especially what level of arousal related to emotions, can be an optimal facilitator of good decisions, and how this can become a mediator, for example, for meaningful processes of behavioral change. However, if this is the case, and if we are, of course, this is a brief presentation, so I don't have the chance to argue at length about the shortcomings of the dual process theory kind of approach. But if you are interested, of course, I can provide much more details. And there is a very, very interesting literature that is being developing these very years that is accumulating very, very interesting evidence, not only from the neuroanatomical point of view, but also, of course, in terms of neurocognition and neuroaffective processes and so on and so forth. The point is that, however, if we are starting to refute a dual process theory kind of approach, one of the biggest consequences of this kind of approach also comes under scrutiny. And this is the idea that we are so dominated by biases. The idea that we have so much flaws in our biobehavioral design that unfortunately we are very bad decision makers. Well, I simply pose you one question. If we are so bad at deciding, how did we manage to become so successful in colonizing practically every environment on Earth we were interested in? That doesn't sound very reasonable. The point is that what we tend to call biases are simply results of what we could call an evolutionary mismatch. The problem is that our cognitive suite, our toolbox, has been designed for a very different evolutionary environment than the one we live in. The environment for which this has been designed was the environment of hunters and gatherers. Practically the whole evolutionary history through which our cognitive hardware has evolved was that of hunters and gatherers. Small bands of 50, 100 people, foraging, and of course, as a consequence of this, living in a completely different environment than the one we are accustomed to. The real issue from this point of view is not that our hardware is flawed, but that our social environment, especially in the last few centuries, has changed so quickly that inevitably our hardware couldn't keep up. This doesn't mean that we are flawed. This simply means that the pace with which we are transforming our environment is too quick for us to catch up in terms of fundamental biobehavioral programming. As a consequence of this, we need, of course, different kinds of tools to keep up from this point of view. And what kind of tools are there? Well, we'll see in a moment. So, however, this is something that I really want to stress. This incredible emphasis that is prevailing today in public policy fora in terms of the biases, the need to overcome them, and how flawed we are as decision makers is really something that should be seriously reconsidered. Because, by the way, it tends to have a very, very undesirable implications, as the fact, for example, that the reason why we find ourselves in very bad conditions, like, for example, diabetes induced by obesity, or let's say any kind of unfortunate circumstance that is that is threatening our mental health or physical health or social exchange and so on and so forth is related to the fact that we are bad at something. That's not the point. The point is, what kind of environment are we designing and how this relates to this particular hardware that we have. Okay, this said, let's consider in particular, let's consider in particular what is the relationship between emotions and cognition that emerge from empirical studies. Well, that's interesting because this particular law, the so-called Yerkes-Dodson law, is something very old. The original studies from 1908. There has been a period in which it has been forcefully refuted, but now that we have the right computational neuroscience tools, we are learning that that's a pretty accurate way of describing the interaction between cognition and emotion in many different circumstances. What is the essence of this law? Which, by the way, is only an example of what we are learning in terms of the complex interaction between emotion and cognition. Basically, the law says that there is an inverted U-shaped relationship between arousal and performance, which means that no arousal and too much arousal are unfortunate conditions for cognitive performance. So if you are overjoyed, for example, that's very nice, but probably that's not the best moment, for example, to decide about a mortgage. But on the other hand, if you are completely unemotional in a certain moment, more surprisingly, that's as an unfavorable environment for taking important decisions as the fact that you are completely taken over by a certain type of emotional arousal. In fact, the optimal range, the sweet spot, from the point of view of best cognitive performance, is a moderate level of arousal. As you see, for example, in this graph, in which you have 3 different tasks, and you see the number of trials needed to reach, for example, the learning criterion and the shock intensity, so the intensity of the, in this case, of the emotional stimulus. And you see that, for example, for different tasks, there is generally this inverted U-shaped relation. In terms, of course, you have to consider the optimal performance as the mirror image of this, the upside down flip. But clearly, there is a U-shaped relationship from this point of view. However, the actual position of the U and the actual shape of the relationship depends on the specific task and on the context. This means that we don't have an iron law of optimal cognitive performance as related to emotion. We know that they are related. We know that there is a sweet spot, but where the sweet spot is changes depending on the specific task and context. However, what is important is that emotional arousal not only is not a source of noise for good decisions, but is an indispensable condition in the proper, of course, proportion for cognitively efficient decisions. Okay, so what is the real issue? So if the issue is not that emotion is bad, what is the problem? Well, the problem is that unlike what Kahneman said in terms of a contraposition of 2 systems, there is in fact a contraposition that we have to consider. But first of all, it's not a black and white one, it's blurred. It has to do with different degrees, and it doesn't have to do with the prevalence of emotion and automatic behavior versus deliberative and slow behavior, slow reasoning. But it has to do with how expensive a certain mental state is for us to reach. By expensive, of course, in this case, we are thinking of the biological expense. For example, the glucose consumption that is related to the mental processing that is enabled by this particular process. So the distinction is between easy to reach states that are easily enabled and easily embraced by our brain, that generally are brought about by well-connected areas of our network, brain network, and they are well controlled. So in this case, we are really good at mastering, these particular states. However, there are also difficult to reach states that need very, very specific forms of cognitive control. And to be actually sparked, need the recruitment of not well-connected circuits that are relatively disconnected from the others. So there is a sort of switch that we need to pass to these situations, these mental states that are difficult to reach. But what is the kick here? The kick is that they are not characterized by high emotion versus high cognition, but they intertwine emotion and cognition. And this is very easy to understand by practical examples. If you, for example, as a scientist, let's say you are accustomed to running econometric regressions, okay? They are highly cognitive, certainly not emotional, and very, very, very technical. However, after you have run, let's say, a few thousand regressions, you clearly develop not simply routines, but you develop a very, very efficient networking system that enables certain types of behaviors that are in some sense easy to reach because they are so frequent in your experience that in some sense they get almost automatic. Not too much, because if they get almost automatic, of course, too much automatic, probably you are making mistakes in terms of the science that you're producing. But nevertheless, of course, I mean, you are so routinized in this that you can really run many of them very, very quickly, and they become easy to reach states. But consider, for example, a completely different situation in which you are extremely stressed out and you have to calm down to take a decision. Has this to do simply with, let's say, thinking more? No. To cool down from a stressful state, you really need a very, very complex emotional transition. Everybody, for example, was being into the mindfulness activity or sphere, or people who, for example, use music to stress out and to meditate, know very well that in this way, you can reach states that are difficult to reach, but that once you have reached are not states that are emotionally neutral. They are emotionally very well characterized, but at the same time, it's not something that you can reach with a snap of the hand. It's something that really needs a preparation. So that's the point. The fact that certain states, mental states, are difficult to reach and expensive or easy to reach or cheap has nothing to do with emotion and cognition in principle. It's a mix of the two. But what are the switches that allow us to pass from a situation that is easy to reach to a situation that is difficult to reach? Well, surprisingly or not, depending on the perspective, arts and culture are one of the most efficient ways to activate the switch. And as I said, I mean, during the pandemic, this has become a sort of natural experiment so many of us actually experience. In a situation in which you are really stressed out, if you listen to the right music, you transition to a completely different mental state. This mental state is not easy to achieve, but through that channel, it can be achieved quite well. So the point is that this kind of experiences are reprogramming our neural activation patterns. Arts and culture is not the only one. For example, contact with nature is another one. There are quite a few ways of activate the switch, but the point is that arts and culture are probably the most flexible and ubiquitous that we have. So as a consequence of this, we are learning that first, short-term emotional arousal can improve cognitive control. Emotions can help us modulate our cognitive flexibility, and arts and culture can become an extremely powerful master switch to enable this particular effect. Let's reflect briefly to what it means in terms of behavioral interventions. So the poster child of the dual process theory is nudging, which means that the implication of a contraposition between emotion and cognition is the idea of imagining behavioral interventions that are basically recruiting cognitive response and that try to neutralize emotions as a source of impulsive behavior that has to be discouraged by this. What have we learned about nudging? Well, we have learned that the effect size of most nudging interventions is pretty small, but even more of concern, the fact that they are not sticking at all. They tend to be very volatile. This volatility is due to what? Well, it's due to the fact that, unfortunately, an exclusively cognitive kind of intervention is difficult to stick for the simple reason that the biobehavioral architecture that we have developed to make experiences stick is, guess what? Emotions. Emotions exist for that purpose, among other things. Emotions, thanks to emotions, an experience that is judged as salient by our motivational system goes into permanent memory. And if you reflect on the experiences that have been most meaningful to you in your lifetime, almost inevitably, all of them has to do with a big emotional response. So the point is that arts and culture, on the contrary, not only recruit emotions, but in some sense build on emotions in a way that plugs exactly into the master switch framework that I discussed previously before. So in this sense, arts and culture intervention can be much more impactful than nudging because they really use, in a very, very evolutionary savvy way, the particular mechanism of transition between easy and difficult to reach states, by so doing, improving our capacity to reach them also at a reasonable biological cost. So not only they allow us to reach difficult to reach states, but we allow us to reach them more and more easily. The more we are fluent and conversant with these particular properties of cultural experience. An example, and then I'm going to finish. We have developed with a colleague of mine at Harvard, Doris Sommer, a protocol for behavioral change called pretext. It's a very simple arts intervention that uses any kind of text, literally any, from let's say highbrow literature to what do you want, to foster the collective capacity to interact in a non-competitive and non-judgmental way to create together using the text as a canvas. This is a very, very sketchy description, and you probably don't get the essence of it from these few words. But if you're interested, I invite you to go to pre-text.org online, and you will find the whole protocol, and you will really have all the information about how it really works. This particular protocol has been applied to fragile subjects and communities, but also to any kind of people and participants worldwide, and but also in particular to very, very difficult situations of people under trauma, violence, and abuse. So I will briefly present you the results of a randomized control trial that we have developed with this protocol that illustrates, I think, nicely what I have been saying so far in terms of arts intervention and behavioral change. So in this particular case, we have considered a neighborhood of Nairobi, Kibera in Kenya, adolescents with problems of violence and trauma and exclusion in one of the most dysfunctional and critical neighborhoods of the metropolitan area. In this particular case, adolescents suffering from mental health conditions, some of whom serious ones. In this case in particular, the trial involved 235 adolescents in the age group 13-19, and we simply administer to them daily 1-hour sessions for 5 days, 5 hours overall. This is more or less 1/3 of the actual protocol, that is around 15 hours. But of course, in these critical conditions, we should be very frugal also in terms of time spent and keeping attention, in this case, of the participants. So this particular protocol has been administered by the young adults of the same neighborhood for the simple reason that in Kenya, you have more or less 1 psychiatrist for 1 million inhabitants. So traditional interventions are out of the question. So in this particular case, this was a study conducted with the University of Nairobi and Harvard University, my university, and the Shamiri Institute. That is a mental health institute created by a graduate from Harvard with Kenyan origin, Tom Osborne, who's also the lead author of this study. So in this particular case, we administered the protocol that I briefly mentioned against the control. And it turns out that after 5 hours, compared to the control, the protocol brought about a statistically significant drop of depressive symptoms, also anxiety symptoms. And the interesting thing is that they were stable after 1 month, just 5 hours. And for the subset with serious, medium to serious depression symptoms, the same results carried over for depression, not for anxiety, but this is particularly remarkable because a pharmacological intervention would have likely not produced an effect comparable to this. So what is the interesting thing? This protocol is completely cost-effective. It costs practically nothing and can be administered by anybody who's trained, like in this case, young adults from the same neighborhood. So this means that there is an extremely powerful response that is very difficult to justify through traditional approaches, but that in this case replicates exactly the implicit logic that I have unpacked for you in the previous part of this presentation. So what is the consequence of this? The consequence is that I just had the time to present one intervention, but now we are working with my research group with a project that have to do with all kinds of behavioral change scenarios in terms of environmental sustainability, loneliness, marginalization, you name it. And the interesting thing is that in this perspective, arts and culture interventions can really become an alternative paradigm for behavioral change. Probably, has to be proven, of course, but I mean, the early results are very promising, and the reasons are, of course, also in the conceptual framework that we are discovering behind this, probably more effective and especially more durable than nudging. So, but designing these kind of protocols requires not only social scientists or psychologists, neuroscientists, it requires arts and culture professionals. So we really have to work a new alliance from this point of view and design this protocol together, because this protocol makes sense if they have, of course, real meaning from the artistic and cultural point of view. And finally, they can be extremely cost effective. So this means that in terms of public health, social cohesion, environmental sustainability, all the big societal challenges that we are tackling, this means that we could probably have interesting solutions to experiment with that not only cost very little, but could liberate resources through the savings that they entail to, for example, finance more activity in the arts and culture. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. So thank you very much. And I am at your disposal if there is any question or comment.
Thank you, Pierluigi. It's a very, very fascinating talk. And I'm sure, I mean, at least I can say for myself that I've learned so much about human biology that I didn't know before. And I have the sense that this might be a feeling shared by a lot of the people listening and watching the seminar. Now, we have now a Q&A session. So before asking questions myself, because I have a few, I'll now turn to the audience in order to ask questions. So I'll collect them. So I have already one question coming, a couple of questions coming. I'm sure more will come next, but I'll start from these two. The first one is actually related to artificial intelligence. And is what are the implications of this research, like the Yerkes-Dodson law, for those developing artificial intelligence technologies and algorithms that are tasked with making important decisions that affect our lives? That's one question. The second one by Tanya is, thank you for the presentation, of course, and can you please comment on how it is possible to ensure that this knowledge is not abused? For example, manipulation by authoritarian political regimes. And I don't know, there's maybe time for a third question by Charlie. I was very intrigued by your conclusion that arts and culture might be more powerful in influencing emotions than nudging, and is curious to know about further publications to learn about this. So I guess that we can probably create a list and or send the list later. So shall we start from these three? The first on artificial intelligence, the second on the risk of abusing.
Absolutely. So first of all, artificial intelligence. Well, you know, we have really learned too little about artificial intelligence to draw any kind of conclusion. But since artificial intelligence has been trained on human material, you have probably made some experiment with the AI, especially with, of course, chatbots and large language models. And you're probably seen that if you are kind to these systems, they react differently. This is not because they have been designed to do this, but because they are in some sense interiorizing and reacting to the human material that they have been trained upon, sorry. So what does this mean? It means that we should probably not consider artificial intelligence as an alien form of intelligence. At the moment, by the way, it's probably not an intelligence yet, properly speaking. What is happening is that, in some sense, this is an incredible compression of so much knowledge and so much, by the way, narrative and imagination that has been produced by humans. So in a sense, we should not consider the interaction with artificial intelligence with something that is intrinsically different from what we have been considering so far. By the way, this also means that probably artificial intelligence can become an interesting resource, for example, also to contribute to broaden our set of tools, for example, to engage people in terms of emotional arousal. For example, there is a small but quickly growing experimentation of use, for example, of artificial intelligence for psychoanalysis, and more generally to engage people in deep conversation that have to do with very, very important existential topics. This means that what I'm saying, the fact that artificial intelligence, of course, is a resource, but also in some sense is a mirror image, is a reflex of what we are, means that probably what we are learning about our own sensitivity to emotional arousal for taking good decisions probably would mean that in the future, we will see artificial intelligence evolving also in terms of developing an emotional competence and not only a cognitive competence in terms of response. Because, I mean, if it is designed on our own bio-behavioral hardware, this is probably the natural evolutionary path that it will follow. Of course, this is just speculation and it couldn't be otherwise because we have very, very little experience with this yet. I mean, 5 years ago, probably nobody would imagine what we are talking about now about this, so you understand really the pace of change. But this, I think, is a fascinating topic that is related to the more general topic of affective computing. So the fact that the affect is a sphere that is, I mean, in the traditional conventional wisdom could be considered as literally the opposite, the dialectical opposite of cognition and computation, but that's actually not the case. I mean, affective computing is a thing and is developing very quickly. In terms of abuse and manipulation, of course, I mean, in some sense, we could find lots of examples of very skillful uses of arts and cultural interventions that were designed to manipulate or to abuse people. That's inevitable. I mean, there is no neutral instrument from this point of view. Anything that is effective on humans can be used badly or wisely. I mean, there's no way. I mean, from drugs, any kind of drugs, including pharmaceutical drugs, and whatever. I mean, the school system, religion, name it. I mean, there's no way to avoid this dilemma. So this means that, of course, there is no safe path to this, but also at the same time, it's clear that the more we make people familiar with cultural experiences that are able to foster behavioral change in ways that improve people's lifetime, people life conditions, and of course that, by the way, last along the lifetime in terms of becoming sticky and really fostering long-term behavioral changes. Well, there are better opportunities and better possibilities that this kind of opportunities are used in the good way. But again, there's no guarantee from this point of view.
Excellent. I have two further questions from, actually three. Two are from our own Jonathan Sapsed is asking, is there a hierarchy? Is there a hierarchy in the different artistic media that have power to influence emotions? And then I have a question from Hassan. There is an emerging literature claiming to find evidence that creative services like design in effect provide innovation services to businesses, thereby improving business performance. The theoretical mechanism is invariably framed in cognitive behavioral terms. Firms can be nudged into being more innovative. So what, if anything, might the alternative paradigm you set out to say about these effects?
Very good. Really, really interesting question. So first of all, no, in terms of artistic media, I see no hierarchy at all. It really depends on so many different contextual conditions. For example, in different societies, different forms of cultural experience could have, let's say, different implications, because it really depends. For example, visual arts, as we have developed in the West, is something that has been, in some sense, imposed to some extent on a non-Western context. The idea, for example, of the myth of the artist as the individual creator is something that in the West, for example, has produced a certain type of response. If we have, for example, the idea that a certain masterpiece has been produced by a very, very important artist, this gives an impression to us that really depends not only on the artwork, but also on the fact that the aura that is related to the fact that this has been produced by, let's say, a privileged creative human being. For example, in other cultures, this is not the case. In other cultures, there is the recognition that creativity is diffused, and there are not particular hierarchies unless they have been engendered in particular by Western colonization. And this means that, for example, visual arts can have a different way and different pathway, for example, of behavioral impact, but also to the contrary. For example, we are in most cases, not always, but in most cases, we are prone in the West to listen to music passively and staying still. In other cultures, it's practically impossible listening to music and not dancing. This makes a completely different consequence in terms of what kind of biobehavioral effects are generated. So this really means that the cultural context makes all the difference, and the way in which any specific culture frames a certain type of experience may have a very, very different consequence from this point of view. However, in this moment of, let's say, cultural contamination, this means that even if we have a legacy from a certain culture, this doesn't prevent us from learning other ways. And of course, opening up also the possibilities for us to be influenced by culture in this particular regard. So no hierarchy, but practically everything works under suitable conditions. But by works, I would like to stress that I'm not making a case for the instrumentalization of culture. That's very important, because this is a debate that always pops up at some point. But it's important to understand this. The way in which culture has emerged in human societies has been, from the very beginning, deeply related to the aspects of emotional control and behavioral change. The fact that there has been a moment in human history in which we have invented a form of culture that should have been experienced for the sake of it without any other implication is a complex cultural construct, and is basically Western, and in particular, it's related to the Greek-Roman tradition. Outside of this, I mean, culture has always been part of this idea of, let's say, humans in a state of flux, in which the cultural sphere cannot be properly separated by other spheres. And even at the dawn of Greek civilization, we have to remember that the theater of Epidaurus was in the middle of the temple of Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. So, I mean, we are not saying anything that has not been deeply entrenched in our human cultural history. But coming to Azam's question that, as always, is extremely interesting and witty, well, design thinking, from this point of view, could be really reinterpreted in the way that I've described before by a completely purposeful, although not intentionally founded like this, master switch. Because this is exactly what design thinking does. It's bringing you to a different level of perception and a different level of affordance, for example, with respect to certain things. That is not something that we easily get. But this is not nudging. This is not simply, let's say, making us more attentive of one possibility and convincing ourselves that this is good. No, as we know, design thinking works when it has an emotional perk. So this emotional perk is exactly that master switch facilitator to reach easy, difficult to reach mental states that is so precious for us. And the reason why it works is exactly that the traditional design thinking has not emerged from the literature on dual processes, not at all. It has emerged from a completely different area in which there has been no taboo about emotional engagement, and fortunately so. So we have already developed a very, very powerful culture that, for example, can work in certain circumstances at least very well to this purpose. But again, I think that in the moment in which we start to explicitly design interventions, in this case, being aware of what is the underlying neuroscience, this could probably help us to make them even more effective. And this has also to do with the neuro-founded design. For example, at my university, we are about to launch a new international master program for which we have just received a first starting Erasmus Mundus grant on extended mind and design of physical and mental environments. Sorry, physical and digital environments. So I think that there is an enormous space for experimentation in the field. And by the way, for anyone who is interested in these specific topics, we have still open and a call for papers on various journals of the Frontiers portfolio that have to do with this topic.
Yeah, Luigi, I have two further questions in the interest of time. There's a third question that I'll pass to you, and apologize to the person who has asked. It's a rather long question, but I'll pass it to you. One question is from Ashley. Have you or any of your colleagues explored what the implications of these findings may be for cultural policy? I think that's especially in the context of instrumentalization. And then the other question is in terms of art intervention that could make people are angry. Are these necessarily worse than those that make people happy? And what do they say to standard approaches to measuring subjective well-being? And there is a further question on further examples beyond pretext, but I'm not sure there is time to answer all these questions. So I'll pass the remaining questions to you later. And apologizing with those who have asked the questions, but we'll follow up later.
So very briefly on these questions, although they would reserve much more time. For cultural policy design, well, this has been the other side of my activity. I've been the advisor of the European Commissioner for Culture for a few years in the previous commission, and we have worked exactly on this, a new policy approach that tries to internalize. Although at the time, of course, we didn't have the kind of background awareness of the deep processes that I have been presenting to you today. There's instrumentalization really becomes an issue when you have, let's say, a narrow-minded and dumb approach to this. Just to make an example, let's say culture and health. If you start prescribing, for example, museum visits as you would prescribe pills, that makes no sense. Because, of course, it's like advising people to marry because it turns out from research that married people are happier. That's not the best way to get happy through marriage. Because, of course, the problem is putting people in the condition to appreciate the meaning of the experience. So this cannot be prescriptive to the level of literally fine-tuning or micromanaging the experience of people to obtain short-term specific results. Also because, and that's the other issue, we have a problem here that is called so-called problem of proxy failure. We cannot confuse what is a measure with a target. So measuring, for example, how certain types of things affect the well-being of people doesn't mean that we can design policy interventions in which we are targeting that same measure that we use to monitor what's happening as a goal. Because by doing this, we completely jeopardize the effect of what we are doing. And there are nice examples. I can suggest you to stay tuned, for example, to Behavioral and Brain Science is one of the most important journals in neuroscience today, where there is a lead article really interesting that has to do with this called Dead Rats and Dopamine. So the title is pretty catchy, in which this phenomenon of proxy failure will be explained in detail. But so that's the point. What I'm really concerned about are damned applications in the policy realm on this kind of finding. We have to preserve the richness and complexity on cultural experience, and especially create in people the opportunity to build a motivational base. We cannot be prescriptive. I don't like at all approaches like audience development, for example, because they are paternalistic in itself. It's like, I have the model of experience that you should adopt for you to be better. How can I pretend to know what could be better for someone, better than themselves. So, you know, the issue is that you can only create, let's say, the field conditions for certain things to happen, but then, of course, you have to trust the capacity of people to judge for themselves. So from this point of view, I think that a non-paternalistic approach from this point of view is not only possible, but quite viable and certainly less paternalistic than what has been applied so far in terms, for example, of traditional behavioral change interventions like nudging.
Excellent, Pierluigi. I think we need to bring discussion to an end because there are more questions, but unfortunately we don't have the time to answer them all. So let me thank you for your very engaging presentation on what is definitely cutting edge research at the interface of different disciplines. And I'm sure that our audiences will agree that your presentation has broadened our understanding of the role of the arts in health and well-being, an area that seems really in continuous and fast-growing expansion. I would like to thank, beyond you, also our founders, the HRC and the team at Newcastle University, and the Creative PEC, in particular, Ingrid, Billy, Anna, Alice, Tom, and last but not least, Hassan, our center director, for all the hard work put into making this webinar happen. And now looking ahead, we have as our next seminar speaker, Professor Jen Snowball. Jen is a professor of economics at the Department of in South Africa, and she will give a talk about the economic geography of fashion design in South Africa, potential beyond large fashion cities. Now, please annotate this event in your calendar, and it's for the 16th of May. So looking forward to our next event in the series. And thank you again, Pierluigi, and to all those who've been online with us today. Looking forward to the next seminar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.